Cool. Hi there. So my name's Matthew Dolan. I work at Babylon Health here in London. And today's talk is actually going to be a little bit about certificate pinning and its potential replacement, certificate transparency. So, there's an initial question, really. Is HTTPS secure? Who thinks HTTPS is secure? Not many people. The truth is, actually, it's not too bad. But it's helpful actually if we understand a little bit about how we actually go about establishing HTTPS connections in the first place, to understand what some of the weaknesses are with that and why then actually certificate transparency is a potential solution for that. So when we try and establish a secure connection, actually the first thing that happens is the client, so obviously your mobile app, sends a hello message, and the server responds with its own hello message. And in that, it provides a certificate. And really, what happens there with that certificate is so the certificate would be the leaf certificate on the left that comes from that handshake. Your phone then basically tries to build up a chain of trust using that leaf certificate, using the issuer distinguished name to find a subject distinguished name for an intermediate certificate all the way down to a root certificate that's on your device. Now, the thing with that is then, the other side of that, and how the sort of trust comes in, is the public key from that root certificate is used to check the issuer signature of the intermediate certificate, and the same up to the leaf certificate. But actually, what's really happening here is actually we're trusting that the certificate authority, the one who actually signed that root certificate, is trustworthy. Now, actually, this actually all started from actually the Netscape browser back in the early 90s. They made the decision to actually install these root certificates in their browser, and actually that's how HTTPS has sort of established itself with this form of trust. So the really question comes is, can you actually trust certificate authorities? If I give you an example of two names here, DigiNotar and Komodo, they both have trust in their slogans. So, do we trust them? Unfortunately not. Back in 2011, actually, both of them were actually hacked. With DigiNotar, actually, this meant they'd actually generated certificates for Google domains. That actually meant for 5 weeks, people could basically do man-in-the-middle attacks where they could pretend to be Google, which is, clearly not particularly great. And this is the thing, there's this assumption basically that, of this sort of element of trust. And although, as I said, there's nothing necessarily inherently insecure about HTTPS, it's built on having that trust of those certificate authorities. But if you don't trust them, this is why you then look at things like certificate pinning. So, with certificate pinning, it basically works by, given you've got the same sort of certificate chain, using the public key somewhere in that chain, you basically look to see if that public key appears somewhere in your chain, and because you're seeing that, you can assume that it is a trusted chain. Now, ultimately, as I say, if your public key doesn't appear, you block that connection. And actually, implementing this actually on Android, if you're using OKTP, it's actually very straightforward. You'd need to figure out a particular pin for your server, but actually you can do it in pretty much one line of code. But the problem with pinning is actually getting the configuration right is hard. There's a lot of decisions you need to make. For one thing, you kind of have to think about which actual certificate you actually pin against. Do you pin against the leaf certificate, or do you pin against that sort of root certificate, or even one of the intermediate ones? And in fact, you can also have choices over whether it's just the certificate you're pinning against or actually the public key, although most of them do it against the public key pinning. And you also have to think a lot about how you kind of handle things like compromise. So if a pin, if your certificate, if the public key for your certificate, the private key for your certificate was leaked out, and you need to change the certificates, how are you going to handle that sort of compromise? How are you going to change the pins in your app? And actually, just to put this into sort of some context, Smashing Magazine, I mean, this is a website example, but actually they knew they were changing their certificates, and because of that, they changed their web header to change the pin. Unfortunately, they didn't do this in a particularly graceful way, and actually what it meant is they actually ended up blocking a portion of their users for basically up to a year, because that's the next time their browser would actually check for an update to the pinning headers. Obviously on mobile, it's not necessarily quite as bad as that. You have the time to push out another update, but it depends on how quickly you can push that update out is how long your app's going to be blocked for. And actually, some of these sort of problems here, actually this is why actually Chromium in July 2018 have actually dropped, deprecated support for certificate pinning. And what they're doing instead is actually introducing certificate transparency. Now, certificate transparency actually was first actually established actually in 2012, but obviously actually a lot of people actually haven't even heard of it. I myself actually became familiar actually really actually about a couple of years ago. The idea with it though is you're trying to make it, for one thing with the certificates, you're trying to make it, when a certificate's created, you're trying to make sure that's public knowledge that a certificate exists. And because it's public knowledge, you can then try and actually, the idea is you're trying to make it hard for someone to actually generate a certificate for your own server without you kind of knowing about it. And because you know if someone's created a rogue certificate for you, as I say, you've got the opportunity to try and get the certificate revoked and take an action. Now, the idea then as well is actually we can also do auditing and things like that, and actually this is where it sort of aims to try and protect the user actually from sort of misissuance. So as I say, it's all about public logging. So there are actually a lot of log servers out there where any time a new certificate is generated, whether it be Amazon or one of the other certificate authorities, entries for those certificates will actually be sort of cryptographically added to these log servers. And I say those log servers can then be audited and checked to make sure they are accurate and kept up to date. And actually the idea with these log servers, they are append only. They use behind the scenes a Merkle tree hash, which I could never explain what it actually does, but it's worth sort of trying to understand that the idea behind it is that being append only and using the Merkle tree hash is all about trying to make sure that these log servers are actually sort of tamper-proof. And as I say, part of that is then being able to spot misbehavior and actually be able to aid auditing and monitoring. And actually, if back in 2011 we were actually using things like certificate transparency instead, things like that Diginotar attack actually would have been spotted actually within hours rather than the actual weeks it actually took. Now, obviously the question is, does certificate transparency work? So, interesting enough, actually, two companies that come to mind. Facebook, firstly, they're quite big on certificate transparency. They had actually spotted, well, their security team had actually managed to spot where some, effectively some certificates been generated that their security team hadn't known about. And they were actually then able to do something about it. Fortunately, in this particular instance, it wasn't something malicious. It was a developer had used a certificate authority that wasn't their standard one, and they were able to sort of get those revoked, and actually, no harm came about it. But actually, Google also spotted an actual certificate authority who had been issuing certificates for Google domains. They were supposedly only test certificates that lasted only a few days, but again, because of certificate transparency, they were able to spot this and actually reprimand that certificate authority and actually spot this thing. So does it work? Well, yes. But actually the important thing really with certificate transparency is actually you need to actually go about monitoring your domains. There are some tools you can use. Facebook actually, both these are free. Top one is open source. Facebook's one actually allows spotting not just certificates being issued on your own domains, but also phishing domains as well. So it's worth looking at that. I realize I'm going a bit too slow, so I'm going to speed up a bit. So in terms of client verification, really there's three ways that you can get information about the certificate transparency data. We're only going to talk about the main one that is which is used in most cases where some of this information is actually embedded in a certificate. And the idea being that, so when a certificate authority creates a certificate, they submit that certificate, well, pre-certificate actually, to a log server. The log server returns with a signed certificate timestamp, and that's actually then embedded into the certificate. And then when you're connecting, the idea is that through the handshake, the certificate already has the signed certificate timestamp, and you use that to verify that this is a real connection. And actually the thing with certificate pinning, and one of the things that made it quite hard, was the fact that you're relying on a pin of one of your certificates. This doesn't rely on that instead, at all. So if you change your certificates or anything like that, you don't actually get any sort of problems with that. So in terms of how you go about implementing this in mobile, iOS, unfortunately, is very, very easy. You can do it in, again, a line of code. Unfortunately, with Android, not quite so straightforward. There were two possibilities, but we're going to skip over that. Since there wasn't a really good solution on Android, actually, Babylon Health actually open sourced their own certificate transparency library. Check it out. I think we've actually run out of time, so I'm going to stop there. But the idea is you can do it in one line of code, basically, to implement certificate transparency in Android, where you're literally just providing your domain name rather than having to provide a PIN and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, but if anyone's got any questions, come chat to me afterwards. I will be over there. Thank you.